The sun hung low over the horizon, a blistering orange disk spilling its last cruel heat over the dry plains. Wind whispered through brittle grass and rattled the broken boards of an old fence. The same fence where Sarah Harlow, barely 18, stood bound and trembling. Her wrists were rubbed raw by the coarse rope. Each breath came shallow, sharp, and dry, as if even the air refused to comfort her. Her father's voice still echoed in her mind, harsh, slurred, and full of bitterness. "You ain't worth the bread you eat, girl. Just like your ma, weak and cursed." His drunken rage had flared without reason that afternoon, and she had learned long ago that reason meant little to a man consumed by whiskey and hate. He had dragged her from the tiny shack they called home, cursing as he tied her to the fence post. She had pleaded once, softly, and that only made him laugh. Then he was gone, the sound of his boots crunching on dry earth fading into silence. Now the world around her had turned to a cruel stillness. The air shimmered, thick with dust. Her lips cracked. Her head ached. Somewhere far off, a hawk screamed and circled lazily overhead. Sarah tried to move, but the ropes held her fast. She whispered a prayer, not for rescue, not anymore, but for the strength to stay alive until nightfall. Hours passed. The shadows stretched long across the open land. Her legs trembled, her body giving way to exhaustion. The fence post creaked in the wind, and for a moment she thought she heard the faint echo of hoofbeats, distant, ghost-like. She turned her head, straining to listen, but the sound faded into the sigh of the plains. Maybe it was just her mind playing tricks. Memories drifted through the haze. Her mother's laughter, soft and full of life before the sickness took her. The gentle hum of lullabies sung beside the hearth. The smell of fresh bread. Those memories felt like stories from another lifetime. When her mother died, her father lost himself in the bottle, and Sarah became a reminder of everything he'd lost. Every drink he took seemed to pour more poison into his soul. Now, alone beneath the wide western sky, Sarah felt the truth settle like dust on her skin. She had been left to die, forgotten by the only blood she had. The pain of that knowledge burned deeper than the rope or the sun ever could. As twilight bled across the horizon, her strength faltered. Her head sagged against the fence post. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of distant rain, faint but real. She wanted to believe it meant something, that maybe mercy still existed somewhere in the vast emptiness. Then, through the hum of the wind, she heard it again, hoofbeats, steady and real this time. A single rider's silhouette appeared on the ridge, outlined by the dying sun. The sound drew closer, deliberate and heavy with purpose. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Part of her wanted to cry for help, but no sound came. She could only watch as the horse and rider descended slowly into the valley below, dust rising behind them like smoke. The last light of day caught the glint of a brass buckle and the edge of a weathered hat. The stranger reined in his horse, eyes scanning the land, until they found her. For the first time in days, Sarah felt something flicker inside her chest, fragile and unfamiliar. It wasn't quite hope, but it was close. The rider dismounted slowly. The sound of boots crunching on gravel came closer. The man stopped a few feet away, silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice roughened by years of solitude, he said, "Hold on, miss. You're safe now." And for the first time, Sarah let her tears fall freely. The man's shadow stretched long across the dirt as he knelt beside her. The setting sun caught in his eyes, steady, gray, and unreadable, like weathered steel. He wore the dust of the trail and the silence of a man used to being alone. His name, she would later learn, was Eli Carter, but for now, he was only the stranger who had come when no one else would. "Easy now," he murmured, reaching for his knife. His movements were slow, deliberate, the kind that said he'd seen too many wounded creatures spook and bolt. The blade flashed once in the dimming light as he cut through the ropes, biting into her wrists. Sarah gasped as freedom returned to her limbs, if it could be called that. She slumped forward, too weak to catch herself, but his arms were there, steady and sure. "Water," she whispered, her voice no louder than a breath. Eli nodded and reached into his saddlebag. He held the canteen to her lips, letting her drink small sips at a time. Her throat burned, but the coolness was a mercy she hadn't dared to imagine. When she tried to thank him, the words tangled in her throat. He didn't seem to need them. When she was strong enough to sit upright, Eli studied her quietly. The bruises on her arms told their own story. The fear in her eyes told the rest. He didn't ask questions. He'd learned that sometimes silence was the only kindness a man could give. "You hurt bad anywhere?" he asked. Sarah shook her head weakly. "Just tired." Eli looked toward the horizon, where the last of the sun was sinking behind a ridge of crimson rock. Night would come fast, and with it the cold. He couldn't leave her there, not with coyotes in the brush, and God knew what kind of men wandering the roads. He untied his horse and lifted her carefully into the saddle before climbing up behind her. The horse shifted under their combined weight, but Eli's hand on the reins was firm. "Hang on," he said quietly. "Ain't far." They rode in silence, the wind carrying the faint cry of an owl. The sky deepened to indigo, stars spilling across it like scattered dust. Sarah leaned against his chest, exhaustion washing over her. The steady rhythm of the horse's hooves, the warmth of the man behind her, it felt unreal. Like a dream born out of fever and desperation. Eli's ranch came into view after an hour's ride at Astor, small patch of light in the darkness. The cabin was modest but sturdy, tucked against a stand of cottonwoods with a single lantern glowing in the window. When he helped her down, she swayed on her feet. "Inside," he said gently, guiding her toward the door. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and coffee. A fire crackled low in the hearth, pushing back the chill. Eli fetched a blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. Before setting a tin cup of warm broth in her hands, Sarah looked around the cabin, the neat order of it, the quiet simplicity. It spoke of a man who lived alone and liked it that way. Yet something about his presence made her feel safe. It was a strange, fragile feeling, one she hadn't known since her mother's death. After she'd eaten, Eli said, "You can rest here. There's a spare room through that door. Ain't much, but it's clean." She hesitated, unsure if she should trust him, but her body made the choice for her. She rose, her legs trembling, and walked toward the room. Before she closed the door, she looked back. "Why'd you help me?" she asked softly. Eli paused, staring into the fire. "Because nobody helped me when I needed it." Sarah didn't understand what he meant, not yet, but the sadness in his voice lingered long after she closed her eyes. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, but in the little cabin, the world finally felt still. Morning came quietly to the Carter Ranch, the first light spilling over the red hills and scattering across the dusty yard. Inside, the scent of brewing coffee mingled with the faint crackle of the hearth. Sarah stirred awake beneath a wool blanket, blinking against the pale light streaming through the window. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was, only that she was warm, free, and breathing. Then the memories returned in flashes. The fence, the rope, the stranger's steady hands. She rose slowly, her body still weak from exhaustion. Her bare feet touched the cool wooden floor as she made her way to the main room. Eli stood by the stove, pouring coffee into a tin cup. He turned when he heard her, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "Morning," he said. "Figured you'd be hungry." A bowl of porridge waited on the table. Sarah hesitated before sitting down, unsure whether she belonged here, in this quiet space that felt too kind for someone like her. "You don't owe me nothing," Eli said, sensing her unease. You just eat and rest. The world'll wait." She nodded and began to eat. The warmth of the food spread through her like sunlight breaking through clouds. Still, the silence between them felt heavy, awkward, but gentle, like two people learning the shape of peace after years of noise. Over the next few days, Sarah grew stronger. She helped sweep the porch, fed the chickens, and mended torn shirts from Eli's saddlebag. He never asked about her past, and she never asked about his. It was an unspoken agreement between two people who'd both seen more than they wished to remember. One evening, as the sky burned pink and gold, Eli found her sitting by the corral fence. The horses moved slowly in the pasture, their silhouettes soft against the fading light. "You handle them well," he said. Sarah smiled faintly. "Mama used to say animals don't lie. You treat 'em gentle, they trust you." Eli leaned on the fence beside her. "Sounds like she was wise." She was. Sarah's voice wavered. "Pa wasn't always like that. When Mama was alive, he tried. But when she passed, something in him broke." Eli didn't answer right away. His gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "Loss'll do that. Makes men forget who they are." He paused, then added, "Sometimes it makes them cruel." Sarah looked at him then, really looked. Beneath the quiet strength of his face, there was something haunted grief etched deep into his eyes. She wondered what he'd lost, but didn't ask. The days passed into weeks. Slowly, laughter began to echo faintly in the small cabin again. Once, Eli found her humming while hanging laundry on the line. Another time, she caught him smiling when one of the barn cats climbed onto his lap. These small, ordinary moments stitched together something fragile, but real, a sense of belonging neither had expected to find. One night, rain began to fall, a steady, gentle sound against the roof. Sarah stood by the window, watching the storm wash over the land. Eli joined her, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Storms don't last long out here," he said. "No," she replied, her eyes tracing the lightning on the horizon. "But they sure do change the land." He looked at her then, realizing she wasn't just talking about the weather. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of understanding. By the time the rain stopped, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. It came quietly, like dawn after a long night. She still carried scars. And Eli still bore his ghosts, but in that small cabin at the edge of the plains, 2 broken souls had begun the slow, steady work of mending. The months that followed brought life back to the Carter Ranch. The air grew warmer, the fields greener, and for the first time in years, Eli Carter found himself coming home to more than silence. Sarah's laughter, soft and rare, lingered in the air like the scent of blooming sage. She tended the animals, patched up the barn roof, and planted a small garden behind the house. Every corner of the once lonely ranch began to hum with quiet purpose. But peace in the West was fragile, and the past had a way of finding those who thought they'd escaped it. One late afternoon, Eli rode into town for supplies. He kept to himself, as he always had, but whispers reached him before he even hitched his horse outside the general store. "Girl living out there with him," one man muttered near the porch. "Ain't right, a young thing like that with a man like Carter." "Reckon she's the Harlow girl," another said, lowering his voice. "The drunk's daughter. Heard he's been looking for her." Eli froze, his jaw tightening. He said nothing, just tipped his hat and went about his business, but the words followed him like dust in the wind. By the time he returned to the ranch that evening, his mind was heavy with worry. Sarah met him by the gate, her face lit by the last light of the setting sun. "You're quiet," she said. He hesitated. "Word's getting around, Sarah. Folks been talking. And your pa, he might be coming." The color drained from her face. "He won't stop," she whispered. "He never does." That night, neither of them slept much. Sarah lay awake in her small room, listening to the creak of the old timbers, remembering the sound of her father's voice, drunk, cruel, unpredictable. She had thought she'd outrun him, but dread settled in her chest like a stone. 2 nights later, the fear became real. It was past midnight when the dogs began barking, their growls cutting through the still air. Eli was already up, rifle in hand, when a voice rang out from the darkness. "Carter!" "I know she's here." Sarah froze in the doorway. The voice was unmistakable, her father's. Ragged, hoarse, and soaked in whiskey. Eli stepped onto the porch, the lantern light casting sharp shadows across his face. "You best leave now," he called, his voice calm but firm. "I'll do no such thing." Her father shouted back, "She's my blood. You got no right keeping her." "She's not property," Eli said. "You lost that right when you left her to die." There was a tense silence, the kind that hangs before a storm. Then the old man stumbled forward, shotgun glinting in his hand. Sarah gasped and ran out before Eli could stop her. "Pa!" she cried. "Stop. You don't have to do this." Her father turned, his face twisted with rage and shame. For a moment, he wavered. The trembling of his hands betrayed him. "You think you're better than me?" he hissed. "You think you can just walk away?" "I don't think," she said, her voice breaking but steady. "I know." Those words hit harder than any bullet could. The old man's shoulders slumped and the fight went out of him. He dropped the gun, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as the daughter he blamed, but as the woman who no longer feared him. Eli stepped forward and took the weapon away. "Go home," he said quietly, "and don't come back." Her father stumbled into the darkness, swallowed by the night. The only sound left was the wind whispering through the grass. Sarah turned to Eli, tears shining in her eyes. "It's over," she said, barely believing it. Eli nodded. "Yeah," he murmured, "but endings don't come easy out here." Still, as he pulled her close and the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, both knew something had changed forever. The past had finally loosened its grip. The days after her father's departure felt different, lighter, though still fragile, as if the land itself was holding its breath. For the first time since she could remember, Sarah Harlow woke without fear pressing against her chest. The nightmares still came sometimes, but when they did, she'd open her eyes to the sound of Eli moving about the ranch, his footsteps steady, his presence quietly reassuring. Spring deepened into summer, and life on the Carter Ranch took on a rhythm that felt almost like peace. Sarah rose early each morning, feeding the chickens and tending to the small vegetable patch she'd planted behind the cabin. The once barren plot now bloomed with rows of beans, corn, and wildflowers she'd gathered from the valley. It wasn't much, but to her, it was a miracle, a place where things grew instead of died. Eli watched from a distance most days, content to let her fill the quiet with her quiet determination. He worked the cattle, repaired the fences, and taught her the ways of ranch life, how to spot a storm before it hit, how to read the moods of the horses, how to listen to the wind. Sarah learned quickly, eager to prove she belonged here, not as a guest or a burden, but as someone rebuilding her own world. One morning, as they fixed the east fence, she caught him looking at her, really looking, and felt a warmth rise to her cheeks. "What?" she asked, smiling slightly. He shrugged. "Just didn't realize how much life you've put back into this place." Sarah brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Wasn't me alone," she said softly. "You gave me the chance." Eli tipped his hat, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "Maybe, but you're the one who made it count." In the evenings, they shared quiet dinners by the fire. Sometimes they talked about the land, about the weather, rarely about the past. Other nights, silence said more than words could. It was a comfortable kind of quiet, the kind that comes when two people understand each other without needing to fill the space between them. Little by little, laughter began to find its way back. Eli found himself smiling at the sound of her humming as she worked, or when she teased him for drinking his coffee black like it owed him something. Sarah, in turn, discovered a gentleness in him she hadn't known men could have, a patience born from pain. Not pride. Still, shadows lingered at the edges of their hearts. Some nights Eli would wake with a start, breath ragged, eyes far away, memories of battles and loss chasing him through the dark. Sarah never asked, but she would light the lamp and sit quietly nearby until his breathing steadied. Other nights, she'd wake from her own dreams, her father's voice echoing through the walls, and Eli would be there, sitting at the edge of her bed, a comforting silhouette against the moonlight. They were two people shaped by wounds, but somehow they'd begun to heal, not by forgetting the pain, but by facing it together. By late summer, the ranch looked transformed. The garden thrived, the fences stood strong, and the air hummed with life. One golden evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the world in warm amber, Sarah stood by the corral fence, the same kind of fence where her suffering had once begun. But this one was different. This one was hers. Eli joined her, leaning against the rail. For a while neither spoke. "You ever think you'd have this?" he asked. Sarah shook her head, her eyes glistening. "No," she said. "But I think maybe it was waiting for me all along. Just needed someone to show me it was still there." Eli nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "Home ain't always a place, Sarah. Sometimes it's just the people who stay." She smiled through her tears. For the first time, she believed him, and as the stars began to rise, the lonely ranch no longer felt like a refuge from the world. It was their world, built from loss, shaped by kindness, and held together by something deeper than either dared to name. The summer slipped gently into autumn, painting the plains in shades of gold and rust. The air grew cooler, the light softer, as if the land itself had found a slower heartbeat. The Carter Ranch, once a lonely refuge for a man who'd given up on life, now breathed with quiet contentment. Every morning brought the smell of bread baking, the soft clatter of tin dishes, and the sound of laughter echoing across the yard. For Sarah Harlow, it still felt unreal sometimes, the peace, the safety, the sense of belonging. She had spent so many years believing that pain was all the world had for her. But here, with Eli Carter, the world had finally begun to give something back. She often rose before dawn to watch the light creep over the horizon. There was something sacred about that first glow, the way it turned the sky from violet to gold, the way the earth seemed to hold its breath before the day began. One such morning, she walked to the edge of the property where the fence ran along the ridge. It was a simple wooden fence, weathered and strong, repaired with her own hands. The same kind of fence she had once been tied to. But now, it stood not as a symbol of pain but of endurance. She'd wrapped wildflowers around its posts, the bright blooms twisting through the rails like veins of color in the desert. They swayed gently in the breeze, as if the earth itself was finally breathing easy again. Eli joined her there, his boots crunching softly on the dry grass. He carried 2 mugs of coffee, one of which he handed to her without a word. They stood side by side, watching the sunrise wash over the land. "Hard to believe it's the same place," he said finally. Sarah nodded, smiling faintly. "It's not," she said. "Not anymore." Eli studied her profile, the calm strength in her eyes, the way her hair caught the light. There was a time he would have looked away, afraid to feel anything too deeply. But Sarah had changed that. She had taught him that love wasn't about possession or perfection. It was about presence. "You done good here," he said. "Real good." Sarah turned to him, her smile soft. "We both did." The wind tugged gently at the wildflowers, and for a moment neither spoke. There was no need. The silence between them had become something warm, something that spoke of everything they had endured and everything they had built. Sarah looked toward the horizon and said quietly, "I think I forgive him." Eli turned to her, surprised but not questioning. "Your father?" She nodded. "Not because he deserves it, but because I need to let it go. I don't want to carry him with me anymore." Eli took a deep breath, then said, "That's strength, Sarah, real strength." She looked up at him. "You showed me what that means." For a long while they stood together in silence, the sun climbing higher, the land stretching endlessly before them. The fence, the same kind that once held her captive, now marked the border of a new life. It no longer divided or confined. It protected Dot as they turned back toward the cabin. Eli reached for her hand. It was a simple gesture, but one that carried a lifetime's worth of meaning. She didn't pull away. "Come on," he said with a quiet smile. "Chickens won't feed themselves." She laughed, the sound light and free, echoing over the open fields. It was a sound Eli knew he'd never tire of hearing. The two of them walked toward the house, their silhouettes framed against the burning gold of morning. Behind them, the wildflowers along the fence swayed in the breeze. Bright and alive, a testament to the life they had rebuilt from the dust for the first time. Sarah didn't feel like a girl rescued from the edge of death. She felt like a woman who had chosen life, who had taken the pain and turned it into something that could bloom. Dot, and beside her walked the man who had given her the chance to begin again. Dot in that golden light. As the day unfurled across the plains, there was no past-only promise.